Well, hi. So my name is Daniel. What should I call you?
Alex is fine.
Alex. Nice to meet you, Alex.
Nice to meet you,
So,
Daniel.
so I hear a bit of an accent there. I'm from the United States. I'm from Sacramento. Where are you from?
From the beautiful country of England, right
Oh,
out in the middle of nowhere right now. It's 11 o'clock over here, so I'm trying to keep it down a little bit for housemates and stuff. Yeah, out in Banbury, England, if you have any reason to know where that is at all.
I have no clue. I know where England is. I don't know if that counts, but
It's
yeah.
broad enough. Broad enough.
But there's another guy on here from England. His name's Bookman, or Michael is his name. But yeah, so he has the same like really cool accent. So I just heard it and I was like, hey, is that? Yeah, I think it is. Yeah. But anyway,
Fantastic.
so when I refer to the alt right in this res, I'm mainly referring to the American alt right, but I don't know if there's an alt right in Britain and everything. But my main focus is this idea of what has led to their rise, and I would say that modern liberalism is one of the key factors that has created the current alt right, or not necessarily that created them, because modern liberalism obviously is completely contradictory to the alt right. But I would say that the actions of modern liberals have contributed to what made the alt right be created and then become popular. So the first thing that I would focus on would be that of identity politics. And this was something that modern liberals have focused on that classical liberals weren't as focused on, because classical liberals were more focused on the power of each individual. And so it wasn't based on, oh, this is a white individual or this is a Catholic individual. It's just you are an individual, here's your power. And they would try and give the power to that individual. But modern liberals are more focused on the idea of creating equality. And part of the reason that they see this is because they see problems in society and that there is discrimination against certain groups, which is accurate and a good reason to be worried. But at the same time, when you start focusing on people as part of a tribe, it creates this idea of identity politics. So you have us versus them. So many of the more conservative and white, usually white, and usually fundamentalist or evangelical Christians, or atheists. I mean, it just depends. But more of these groups had started to feel like they are them. Um, and so Bronson asked the question in the comments of what is the alt right here. What I mean by the alt right, there's two factors to the alt right that I would mainly focus on. The first one would be the alt right that is like Richard Spencer, the far right nationalist, almost anti-capitalist. Like Richard Spencer recently just said they're anti-capitalist and everything, but they're entirely focused on identity politics, but it's identity politics from the white race. So it's from this whole backlash against the identity politics of the left, which creates this, oh, well, I'm white, so I'm in the them. You're the us, we're the them. I'm going to be that them. So that's the first sector of the alt-right. The second sector of the alt-right is the much more popular one. Milo Yiannopoulos refers to them as the alt-light. So more like the conservatives who aren't willing to play identity politics as much, but they still feel this backlash from the left. And so they've created this, ooh, well, I'm countercultural, I'm counter left. So they're the alt light. They're not as tribalistic and identity politics, white identity politics based as the real alt right, but they still have that same focus. So when I ask the question of what has contributed to the rise, I think the fundamental thing that has created this rise is the question of us versus them. Would you disagree with that?
Um, yeah, I
Yeah, I
wouldn't
would
disagree with
disagree with
that.
that.
I
I
find it, sorry, I kind of prepared to put all my stuff on the first faction rather than the second faction as well. So I'm going to have to do some thinking on the fly here. And I was going to break down because even the first faction of the alt-right is actually incredibly nebulous. It was people like Jared Taylor, who interestingly do have associations with people like Milo, but they're more race realist type. And I was going to talk about new school and old school white nationalists like Duke and Richard Spencer and Anglin and the rest of them. Um, yeah, but we can talk about the alt-right as well, because that is a very interesting topic too. So I guess the main thing I would focus on is it's a bit harder to talk about with the second factor because you could argue that identity politics is a big part of it because these are pretty much regular people who haven't strayed that far from traditional conservatism. But for the first faction, especially, I would say it makes a lot more sense to analyze their rise through a series of other factors, including the forming of a alternative media, which allows them to all get their news in similar places, sense of alienation from mainstream republicanism, which I do think is also a major factor for the second group. So I think that a lot of these people haven't been pushed to where they are now from a centrist position by modern liberalism, but more have a lot of dubious beliefs, which normally would be confronted by a strong conservative establishment, which doesn't seem to exist anymore in America. And as a result, they've all drifted quite far right because they want to distance themselves from the establishment. So yeah, I'm not just going to be making the case that modern liberalism contributed to their rise in a major way. What I'm going to try and do, I'm going to try and contrast it to other factors, which I think clearly play a much larger role. And I'm going to try and fit in the analysis through which modern liberalism plays a part within that kind of analysis. And I'm going to try and show that it makes more sense to view it on a wider scale than specifically as a result of philosophical and pragmatic feelings of modern liberalism.
Yeah, okay, I think that's fair. Just to answer a couple of those things, the first thing you talked about is the idea of an alternative media, and that the alternative media has given rise to this idea of the alt-right. I think this is accurate for sure. I think that you have places like Daily Stormer, which are where you'll have the neo-Nazis hanging out, and then you'll see certain subreddits. You'll see 4chan and 8chan even, and the rise of the internet has certainly given a platform to people who would have been marginalized before. So I think that's accurate. But I don't think that that discounts the idea that modern liberalism still played a main factor or was a main contributor to their rise. In fact, my overall response here would be that of traditional media. I didn't know who Richard Spencer was until I saw his Nazi speech. You might have seen the videos of that. And I saw that in a video from The Atlantic, which is obviously traditional media. And I love The Atlantic. I think they're very one of the greatest sources of journalism that's out there. Slightly moderately left, but they're pretty fair-minded. You'll get some articles on the right. You'll get some libertarian-minded articles. But regardless, they are part of the traditional media. And this is the main thing that I think is important to point out here. Part of the reason that the majority of people know who Richard Spencer is because the traditional media has talked about him. They do talk about the alt-right. If the Daily Stormer was the only place where he was able to get out, the majority of people would have no clue who he is. So, but it's the modern liberalism, the more liberal establishment, and you do see more of a slant to the left from the majority of the media, at least in America, we do.
I wouldn't.
You wouldn't agree with that? Okay. Well, I mean,
no, I wouldn't
I'll let you respond to that. I would just say that out of the more, the ones who at least do have more of a liberal slant, the fact that they are talking about Richard Spencer is making people know who Richard Spencer is, which gives him more of a platform and more name recognition to be able to get his message out. And when he does that, that's when you have more people joining his cause because they feel like they are the them in the us versus them, if that makes sense. The other thing you were talking about was there are other factors, that there are a lot of dubious people who had a lot of dubious beliefs, but they're being legitimized by the alt-right and everything, and that there are other factors other than modern liberalism. And I would agree with this. There are other factors, but I don't think that discounts the idea that modern liberalism still has created a lot of the environment and a lot of the contribution that led to the rise of the alt-right.
Yeah, sorry. So probably didn't come through properly because it flips the volume when you both talk. I meant to, I don't dispute the fact that most media in America is quite liberal.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. But I think so I think there's an important distinction to be made here between media recognizing the alt-right and giving them that kind of exposure, and the kind of exposure that actually pushes people into the alt-right. So a lot of people definitely know who Richard Spencer is because he was covered by the Atlantic and recently by Channel 4 in Britain as well. But I don't think that pushed many people to agree with the alt-right. I don't think that actually pushed people into the alt-right. In fact, I would actually argue that the alt-right hasn't massively grown in size. The alt-right certainly has, but the alt-right hasn't massively grown in size. I think one of the main, and I think this is a really interesting point that gets mixed in a lot of analysis. The alt-right's main strength and main strengthening recently hasn't been that they've grown in numbers, it's been that they've become much less factional. And yeah, I mean, it's not so much the case that a lot of people go on to the Daily Stormer, for example, or a lot of people go on to Deep Chat. It's the fact that these messaging boards, these news outlets, what they do is they essentially streamline the information they get so that it doesn't draw out the distinctions between neo-Confederates, white nationalists, the anti-capitalist white nationalists, the libertarian white nationalists. A lot of these people coexist very easily in the same space. And what that means is it means you get cultural spaces such as the Red Eyes podcast, which can have people as varied on as like David Icke, David Duke, Richard Spencer, massive broad range of people who would normally be very divided. And that essentially, I think that is one of the precise main factors, especially because it crosses geographic boundaries. That means you get rallies, most infamously like the one in Charlottesville, where all these people can coalesce, can agree, can fight on the same issues. And that is one of the main points that strengthens them, much more so than anything pushing people into their ranks.
Yeah, okay. I can see a lot of that for sure. And I would certainly agree with you on a lot of this stuff that you're saying. But most of what you're saying, I don't think it necessarily discounts the resolution itself, because even if you're right that there are a lot of other factors, the modern liberalism, I think both of us would agree that there are a lot of elements of modern liberalism that have at least contributed to the alt-right, even the ones who would have been there, even the David Dukes of the world, even those ones, regardless of what they're up against and everything. Part of the reason that they would be part of the alt-right is because of this whole idea of identity politics, which has emerged more recently in history. And that is primarily being pushed by the modern left. So even the David Dukes and the far right, even those ones are being impacted by what they think they're up against, which is modern liberalism. You talked about how there's the traditional media, that there's a difference between giving coverage to the alt-right versus pushing people into the alt-right. And I would agree with this, but my response to this would be knowledge creates recruitment. This is one of the things that ISIS shows us. The fact that people know who ISIS is one of their most effective recruiting tactics. This is why they're on Twitter, because they know that they can recruit people from that. The ISIS also plays the same game with the whole identity politics to Muslims. They know that as long as the right, or even if it's the left, but it usually is the right, is criticizing Muslims, they can tell people, look, they hate you. You need to fight back. Here's how you can fight back. And then they recruit the people on Twitter. It's this whole idea of if it's us versus them, then you can more easily radicalize people. So it isn't necessarily that traditional media is creating the alt-right, but they are giving more notoriety to the people who will then use that notoriety to recruit, which is why you see more focus on the alt-right and specifically on the alt-light. Now, you're right that the alt-right hasn't significantly grown. I think this is a good point. The alt-light, though, has significantly grown. More people are clearly more willing to play anti-liberalism than they were before, which is essentially what the alt-light is. That's where you get the Milos. And you have people like Ben Shapiro, who isn't really alt at all, but a lot of his followers, the more conservative ones, are a lot of the things that they will believe, they get to their conclusions because it's not what liberals think. Because it's this whole idea of an us versus them. And that is started by the whole idea of identity politics that is being primarily pushed by the left and is now being responded to by the right. And the last thing that I will say is that while you're correct that the alt-right hasn't necessarily grown, the defenses that I see of the alt-right have grown. And I'm sort of moderate myself, but I mean, I'm sort of like a libertarian moderate. I would prefer that government leave us alone for the most part. But I mean, I follow sources on the right and the left and the libertarians. But I still follow all sorts of sources. And one of the best gauges for where an audio, for what a source is by reading their comment section. Like for National Review, I know that they are more conservative because their comments are more conservative. For Reason magazine, I know they're more libertarian because their comments are more libertarian. When I read The Hill, there are questions: is The Hill moderate right or moderate left? Well, the comments for The Hill are more left, so that tells me that they are marketing more toward a left audience. Now, the reason that I'm bringing this up now is because when Charlottesville happened, I would see comments on the more right-leaning sources that were defending the actions of the alt-right. And I wasn't even following alt-right sources. So these were independent journal review or whatever, like slightly right conservative pages or what. Well, I mean, IJ I guess is more right, but so I mean, right leaning sources, but that normally wouldn't be far right. And yet the comments on these things, presumably from probably alt-light people, were defending the alt-right, which tells you that it is creating more of this whole us versus them, that, oh, the liberals, they think the liberals are criticizing the alt-right, therefore I must defend the alt-right. So it's lending credibility and legitimacy to the alt-right that wouldn't be there if these identity politics weren't being argued.
Okay, so I think that evidence is definitely worth something, but I think it's worth taking into account the prevalence of brigading on the alt-right, of the amount of members of the alt-right who will go into comment sections everywhere just to start trouble and to get into these discussions, because more than anything, they do like starting arguments with people randomly. And you do see, like, I follow quite a few UK newspapers online, and even in the comment sections of websites like Guardian, The Independent, very left-leaning publications, especially by American standards, you still see a lot of alt-right types of comment section. And it's more because they'll be Googling these events, you know, seeing who they can get into arguments with, when they have more experience in the field. Obviously, when it's their wheelhouse and they know they can kind of fill the notes. And, but I do think that's something. So I guess this means that I should be talking about the alt-right a little bit, and why I think that the analysis which puts the emphasis on modern liberalism for the radicalization of people into the alt-right might not be the best analysis you can take. And I think there are quite a few examples I can discuss of instances where there hasn't actually been, or where there's a lot of hysteria surrounding what is seen as identity politics, but very like strong irrational positions that people haven't actually taken, and especially political events that haven't actually occurred. And I think that when you look at it in this frame, it's clear that it's not actually what modern liberalism does, or what modern liberals actually say, that is the contributing factor, so much as it is a um, kind of hysteria machine which orients itself around that perception, and then uses that as a recruiting tool. And I think if we accept that, then we probably also should accept that if it wasn't identity politics, if it wasn't like the idea that people are sticking up for black rights just because people are black rather than because civil rights are important. And I don't dispute that there are people who do the former rather than the latter on the left. But I think, especially when you take into account how many people take that position, proportionately speaking, it's difficult to say that it's the actual identity politics themselves that are the problem, rather than a machine that uses selective outrage. So I can talk about a couple of examples. One example which was pretty big. I mean, you probably know a lot more about these than I do. I'm going to be talking about American examples. But in the neo-Confederate side of the alt-right as well, I'm not sure if you remember the whole Jade Helm fiasco, when Obama was carrying out a military exercise in Texas. And a lot of people were saying it was the start of a civil war operation, and that it was the start of like nuclear tests and invasions of Texas. You saw a lot of this on places like Infowars, which is a kind of halfway alt-light, halfway alt-right. It gets difficult to define. Um, But you also saw a lot of selective outrage. Well, selective outrage. You saw a lot of outrage, or at least I did, online around certain bill proposed that would apparently allow Hispanic illegal immigrants to vote in California. And when you looked into the substance of the bill, it was clear that they were just trying to make it possible for illegal immigrants to have driving licenses, but keeping like records of the fact that they were illegal immigrants with driving licenses. And the idea was to drive down accident rates while also still not allowing them to vote. But obviously, someone got on Twitter, said you need a driving license to vote in California. Therefore, legal immigrants can get driving licenses, legal immigrants can vote in California. And you see quite a lot of this. I could actually spend hours talking about YouTube personalities who have taken, like on the alt-right, especially, who make careers taking things out of context, finding things to be very selectively outraged about. I mean, I don't know who else here has a sadder life as I do, but if you ever watch This Week in Stupid with Sargon of Akkad, you see all the time he'll go into an article, he'll get really, really mad about it. Halfway through, he'll realize the argument he's making about the first position the article takes taken in the article itself. And you can talk about this especially with issues like the New York bill that was passed recently to make intentional misgendering of transgender people. I know this is getting quite off topic from the alt-right because now we're talking about gender issues. I think a distinct feature of the alt-right, specifically race issues. But I mean, six of one, half a dozen of another to a certain extent. And it was very clear when you watched any video from a legal professional, someone who had spoken to a legal professional, that there were strict interpretations in place that meant that this was strictly targeting harassment. People would draw a broad definition of harassment and then use it to say any misgendering, accidental or not, is going to be punishable with like the maximum possible fine listed under the statute. And so I think, there's lots of examples where it's not so much the politics themselves that are driving people towards the alt-right, it's the perception of those politics. And I think when you take that into account in the analysis, it doesn't make sense to put the onus on the liberals. I think it makes more sense to put the onus on the machine that drives that perception, because it's clear that the actual actions and beliefs aren't necessarily the key driving factor in a lot of these instances. And I'd also like to just quickly address a couple of things about I suppose, the exposure given to the alt-right and how this might mean people are more likely to join certain sects or align themselves with certain personalities. And I think that there is a reasonable, actually with ISIS, there's a good case to be made that publicity counts for a lot. But I think ISIS is a bit of a different case to the alt-right, because with ISIS, you're talking about an organization where there are really no publicly available local justice. You can't go out, check a few magazines, look in a couple of dodgy bookshops and try and find out where there's a jihadist gathering. I mean, it's pretty clear you'd be giving yourself into if you did that. However, there are myriad chapters in all kinds of alt-right organizations that operate on the local level. And in fact, especially if we're talking specifically about Richard Spencer, no one's going to be going off and joining the national politics. What people will be doing is they'll be joining local factions, local groups. They'll be looking online for events that will be advertising to a broad alt-right audience, regardless of whether they know who Richard Spencer is or not. And I hate to keep coming back to the internet thing because it just reminds me of how terrible my life is. But these events are always like publicly broadcast. There are always posts going on. There's always news going on if you just do some Googles. So I don't think raw exposure counts for a whole lot. I will say just very, very quickly that on the British alt-right, exposure is more a factor because it's a lot more fractious and there are a lot of really nasty local sects. And here, like liberal media, BBC is pretty liberal. The liberal media essentially sections that off. So again, I don't think that can be put down to a philosophical feeling. And I think that actually raw media exposure doesn't count for a whole lot in these specific cases. But anyway, I'll hand the mic over.
Okay. So the first thing you talked about there was that alt-right members obviously always love starting trouble, which is a great point, and I agree with you on that. But at the same time, that doesn't mean they make the top comments. They're often arguing with you in the comment threads and everything, but the majority of the viewership of a news source are the ones who will give you the idea of who actually cares. So like if the top comment on a Guardian article, you kind of get the idea of who's actually reading The Guardian, because it'll be the top one because it has 200 likes. It'll have 5,000 likes, or however many is on that news source. So if they're just because alt-right trolls are trolling doesn't mean they make it to the top. And yet what I was seeing from normal right-leaning institutions was that alt-light or alt-right comments were actually making it to the top, which means that they were getting not only made, but they were also getting support from the rest of the community who read those articles, which tells me that there actually was a lot of support for the actions that were going on with the alt-right in Charlottesville. Those sorts of actions in past centuries would have been rejected outright. Even probably like just 50 years ago would have been rejected outright. But part of the reason why even normal conservatives are defending these actions is because they feel this whole idea that, oh, modern liberalism hates us. They hate the white people. They hate the Christians. We're victims. And this is another thing that I think should be pointed out. This isn't even as much liberalism, although it's part liberalism. This is more modern culture. Everyone wants to be a victim. And it's not just the left. It's not just the right. It's not just Christians. It's not just atheists. Everyone wants to show, oh, we are the minority. We are oppressed. They're attacking us. And so then they attract emotion to their side, or at least that's what they think they're doing. And so this creates this whole idea, comes back to the whole question of us versus them. And a lot of that comes down to, at least in politics, that starts with modern liberalism and then comes out through creations like the alt-right. You next talked about how there was a whole lot of hysteria surrounding identity politics, but also surrounding all sorts of other things too. And that it's more a hysteria machine. And then you talked about how it's perception that creates people like the alt-right. It's not politics, it's perception. Which I believe, if I'm understanding you correctly, they're saying that the people who hear the news from the left, it's not as much that the left is forcing them in, it's that the people hearing the news, it's their perception of the news that is what is probably flawed. And to a certain extent, I agree with this. But my response would be hysteria breeds hysteria. It's not just, okay, you created is hysterical news, because what sells with news is, there's a common phrase, if it bleeds, it leads. So the big news is the one that they want to put out, or even if it's not big, it's the scary news. It's scary. Oh, people are dying. Oh, there's a war on Christians. There's a war on this. There's a war on that. These big news stories are the ones that are marketable. And so this hysteria stirs up their audience, so they want to listen again. And when the opposite side hears that hysteria, that breeds hysteria in them. So we're even if they're hearing it wrong, it's still creating this level of hysteria. And in America, as I think you had said you had seen this and everything, but in America, since the majority of news is left, when left-leaning news is breeding hysteria, that has the same consequence for the right when they hear that news. And then you get Fox News, then you get InfoWars. And then the further right you go, you get the Daily Stormer. And so it starts with creating the hysteria in the first place, because that's what sells. And a lot of that would have to do with capitalism, because American news is, it has to sell. They create the hysteria because that's what sells. But adversely, what that does is it also creates a backlash. And that backlash shows up through the alt-right. Your last thing that you talked about how was ISIS is different, and then not quite applicable here because they're more hidden and that you can't go to an ISIS meeting on the corner all the time, which is accurate. But at the same time, I actually think this means the alt-right has more of an advantage in this point, because all I was using ISIS to say was, look at how humans work. Look at the psychology behind it. If it's a question of us versus them, the them will use that to recruit, which is exactly what the alt-right is doing. And the fact that they're getting increased perception, the fact that they actually can be household names. We don't know the names of ISIS's generals, but we do know the generals of the alt-right. We do know the people who are leading the alt-light. So the fact that they're so well known means that they can use this whole idea of us versus them to recruit, which is why you do see a ton more people in the alt-right and even a few more people in the alt-right. And more importantly, we know what the alt-right is doing. Whereas 20 years ago, nobody knew who they were. But now we do.
So first off, just really quickly to address the last part of the discussion, I would take issue with the idea that the alt-right has appeared out of nowhere. It's certainly true that there hasn't been as unified leadership that anyone can point to, but David Duke's been around since the 80s. I think he's been a popular name. I'm not American, so I find it hard to comment, but he's been talked about a lot for quite a long time. I think the main reason why there's unified leadership that people can point to now isn't raw exposure. I think raw exposure has been pretty constant, and I think actually raw exposure through the media is quite insignificant compared to raw exposure people get just through knowing local politics, through knowing like cultural knowledge. Yeah, actually, I suppose you could make the argument that quite a bit of that does come through the media. But I mean, regardless, I think that this stuff has been talked about regardless. I don't think it actually has anything to do with liberal media either, because you see like Fox News, and you especially see people like Breitbart and the Daily Stormer talk about, but not the Daily Stormer, they're not very relevant, but the Daily Caller, I mean, and more right wing, but not far right publications talk about these. I don't think that is specific to liberalism. Um, uh, Yeah, okay. So regarding the questions of the how representative the comment sections are, I was going to say Guardian isn't so popular that you will ever see 200 likes on a post, ever see like 5,000 likes on a post, but I can see how the Hill might be. Um, but I think really the fact that people aren't posting these comments and the fact that there is this general wider acceptance of these ideas. I don't think that really has so much to do with the dialectic going on with identity. I think it has a lot more to do with death of conservative hegemony and the idea of a central establishment in America that can point out and say, okay, so we don't do that. That's a bridge too far. We definitely don't do that. So in the past, you saw George Bush. He was very, very, very vocally anti-racist on quite a number of occasions. I know people talk about that because it doesn't really fit the argument either way. Um, but so you had moderating factors on that side. I remember when McCain was running against Obama, someone started talking about how he was a Kenyan Muslim, and McCain just shut it down straight away. Obviously, with Donald Trump, he goes out and he starts that rumor. He's one of the people who starts it. And I think that shows that what we're talking about here isn't a reaction so much against identity politics, which is inevitable. It's a reaction as part of a dialectic, which is very, very inevitable, I would say. But what's not inevitable is the fact that it isn't checked by a central conservative hegemony or a broad establishment which sets out clear values. And I think that we can see that from the fact that the alt-right has emerged only very recently as well, because the discussion of identity politics, I mean, really, it depends how broadly you're going to talk about it. It's been going on since the civil rights and arguably before. So I think it makes more sense to pin the acute cause of the rise of the alt-right than maybe a broader cause, which I think again is somewhat inevitable. If you're going to have a partisan fight for civil rights, but yeah, okay. So also, I'd like to touch down on the radicalization of media again, because in a couple of your comments, you talked about how. Sorry, give me a second. I need to go back over my notes.
No worries.
Really should have printed them out like a proper debater first time and all that.
No, it's fine.
Okay, so I absolutely agree with your assessment that hysteria kind of feeds hysteria, and it's hard to isolate blame on one side for being hysterical and starting a hysterical reaction. And I wouldn't actually say that it's strictly the right's fault. I think that there is something of an inherent element to reactionary politics which makes it more inclined, or at least better suited to snappy, simple, hysterical headlines without casting aspersions on any individual, of course. Um, But I think the key point there is that it isn't a failing of liberalism in setting out this debate in this way. I think I think without trying to say that one side is particularly to blame, what I'm trying to say is that the rise of the alt-right comes from kind of a bipartisan radicalization of the media and kind of underlying corporate uh, badly incentivized media structure rather than any one particular debate. Because again, I think it's pretty clear that the facts and the individual actions and the actual news don't actually drive a lot of the discussion.
Mm.
And I think I would like to touch on briefly, just to like appreciate how big of a cause this is and how much the success of the alt-right has again pushed it further in this direction. I'd like to talk about a few recent specific kind of causes and symptoms of A, the system existing, and B, this system kind of feeding on itself in a very vicious cycle. So we've seen the rise of Breitbart, and we've really seen the radicalization of Breitbart um, as commenters, as the audience moves further right. So obviously under Andrew Breitbart, it really wasn't as radical as it is today. It's really it moved quite a bit in the last couple of years, but it really moved further in the anti-immigrant kind of no holds barred at all, very trolley, very vicious direction under Bannon and under Milo's latest incarnation. I feel bad pinning blame on Milo Yiannopoulos specifically because he's been so many things over his career. I think he's more of a symptom than a cause, really. And I think we've also seen this on Fox News recently as well. After losing Bill O'Reilly, they've taken Tucker Carlson on. But interestingly, because Tucker Carlson used to be quite centrist, we've seen him a lot more far right positions. So he doesn't talk so much about gay rights now. He doesn't talk so much about individual liberty. What he does talk about a lot is like questions of like ethnicity in regards to immigration. And it's really interesting because this is like one of the key points that's come from a unified alt-right is a very concerted push against the 65 Hart Celler Act from the movement. And we've seen the media respond to that in such a way that I think shows there is a clear relationship between the two. You know, the audience moves further right, the news try and keep up with them and show them more hysterical headlines and further right, and it keeps going, it keeps going. Um, and I think one of the big things that we can take as a specific contributing factor to the acute rise of the alt-right is the rise of fake news, not just on very, very deplorable websites like the Daily Stormer and the rest of it, but also from just a miscellaneous collection of loads and loads and loads of sites, the rest of it, that trade in fear of illegal immigration. Not that there aren't rational debates to be had there, but very non-factual suspicions again, especially surrounding BLM riots as well, and how representative that is of the movement as a whole. And also, there have been a lot of very dodgy black on white crime statistics going around, which don't even match the FBI ones. And again, a lot of refugee crisis history surrounding the composition of refugees going into America. I think this is a key point on how misinformed the debate is because a lot of people they extrapolate from the European refugee crisis to the American response to it, and you hear this all the time to alt-right people watching the videos and the rest of it. What they talk about all the time is horde of like young men, a rise in crime, and an inability to screen people properly. And these could, to some degree, be said to be features of the European refugee crisis, but it doesn't match at all what we know to be the facts about the American response to it, about the very vigorous screening process that's already in place, which takes on average a year, is taking disproportionately women and children. Yeah, so I think that's another good example of how media outrage is driving it. Again, not saying that it's a partisan thing, just saying that it's not anything to do with liberalism, the more acute cause, and that when we look at the idea of how the dialectic between identity politics and the alt-right plays out, it's part of a much larger, simple analysis to do with media, to do with the social elements of politics, and to do with various factors that affect the fracturing and radicalization of the right. And that to focus, and I think generally to focus on the dialectic itself, while itself might not be totally invalid, it definitely misses a lot of descriptive power and really misses, I think, a lot of the point and a lot of the lessons to be learned from the recent rise of the alt-right.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't disagree with you that it's a bipartisan thing, that it's the radicalization of media that often contributes to this sort of thing. And I would never say that it's just modern liberalism that created the alt-right. But I do think that the alt-right is a necessary and expected result of modern liberalism, mainly because of the tribalism and identity politics that were primarily created by modern liberalism. That were they were because they don't show up in initial more Republican focuses. It is early on modern liberalism that created this need for equality to fight against discrimination, which it probably is a good thing. But at the same time, as soon as they created this idea of identity politics, the necessary offshoot of that long term is groups like the alt-right, which is what ultimately did wind up coming about. So let me go through your points here. The first thing you talked about was David Duke has been around forever. And so this shows that it's not necessarily a new thing that the alt-right are around. While I would agree with you that David Duke has been around, my response would be more effective. We've had people like David Duke. We've had the Ku Klux Klan. We've had racists. But never before have these groups been so closely linked to a major party. This is what we have now. We have actual... I mean, I guess you could say that the Democratic Party, actually, back when the Civil War was around, that the Ku Klux Klan was linked to them and everything. But it's been a long, long time, at least, since we had an organization, so we had essentially Nazism that is so closely linked to a major party. And at this point, we're essentially 2 steps away. We have Republicans, we have alt-right, we have alt-right. It's never been that close. The linkage hasn't been that close for a long, long time. And yet now it is. Even during the times of David Duke, the linkage was not that close. In fact, your own point, you talked about George Bush. Well, George Bush specifically disavowed David Duke. That's the whole thing. And yet now we don't have that. And a large reason for that is because of this whole identity politics. And let me go to this whole thing. You talk about there's a death of conservative hegemony. I would agree with this, but the question is why? Why exactly are conservatives unable to fight this? And the answer is they're answerable to their own voters. This is part of the reason why many of these conservative organizations have had a difficult time saying no to Donald Trump, because Donald Trump, as a populist, stirred up their own party, their own voters, to the point where they love him. They've become the party of Trump rather than the party of principles. And as the party of Trump, they are more sympathetic towards these ideas of identity politics. And these identity politics are what make them more far right. So the thing is, these voices are being heard by the conservatives, by the Republicans, because they can't otherwise, because they wouldn't keep their place in office. And what's stirring those people up, you talked about this, the radicalization of media and Donald Trump, these are major contributing factors. And so conservatives can't really stand against that because they'd lose their own position if they did. So we have to ask that whole question. What is it that is driving the alt-right and the alt-right? What's driving them is tribalism and anti-liberalism. And why are they so tribalistic and anti-liberal? You described a lot of this. A lot of this is because what they see in the media is this reactionary politics, this whole, and you say that it's not a failing of liberalism. It might not be a failing of liberalism on its own, but since the majority of these media outlets have a slant toward the left, that is what they are perceived by the right. And when they perceive it that way, you even talked about this, the politics versus the perception. It might not even be an intentional offshoot of modern liberalism, but it is the necessary result. It's what it leads to. When you create identity politics and make that a fundamental part of your focus, and then when media is monetarily incentivized to reach out to you in that way and then reach you through hysteria, the necessary offshoot is that you're going to have this backlash, this reaction, which is what we see from the right through the alt-right. The last things you talked about were Milo is a, it's weird. I actually kind of like Milo Yiannopoulos. I don't know if I'm supposed to say that or anything. I enjoy listening to the guy. I think he's had some problems. I think he's definitely contributed to this whole idea of the alt-right and everything, but he's still fun to listen to. Anyway, but the overall point is simply that it started one way. It started with this creation of identity politics, and then through a necessary offshoot of events, we got to the alt-right. Go ahead and have the final word.
Okay, so I think really quickly, because we are running low on time, and I'm aware we rambled quite a bit in my last section. Really quickly, give an alternative